and welcome back to Cinematic Sarcastic, a podcast that talks all things movies and television. I'm Natalie, and I'm your host. On today's episode, we are going to talk about Renegade Nell. This is a new quote-unquote adventure. That's not what I would categorize it as, but that's what Disney is categorizing it as. Television series that has just dropped on Disney+. Now, the show, as far as I'm aware, the entire season has dropped on Disney+ a few days ago as to when this episode airs. I have only watched up to the third episode, so that is as far as my opinion of the show will go, is to episode 3. There will probably be some spoilers in my review because I'm not sure how to talk about Renegade Nell without talking about the story and kind of explaining why I think the way that I think about it. So if you are interested in watching Renegade Nell, I would tune off of this review, go watch at least the first 3 episodes, and then come back. So Renegade Nell really caught my attention when they started showing the trailers. If anyone is familiar with this television show, it was sort of purported, I guess, to be a female protagonist that essentially is what I took it as kind of a Robin Hood / Three Musketeers-ish type character. It's taking place in, I believe, the 18th century in England. I could be wrong about that, but I'm fairly certain that's the time period that this takes place in. So think swashbuckling, think, that kind of thing, but with a fantasy element to it. This is why I wouldn't categorize Renegade Nell as an adventure. For one, I think as far as adventures go, you have to kind of go somewhere in order for it to be an adventure. And she doesn't really. I mean, she travels around different towns in England, but at least up to episode 3, she hasn't really done any adventuring. There is some talk of it happening kind of before the series starts, and I'll get into that, but not so much, at least in the beginning of the show. So when we are introduced to the character of Nell Jackson, it is told to us time and time and time and time again that she has left her home essentially to shack up and marry a pirate captain by the name of Captain Jackson. And the idea of them just using Captain Jackson, which they say over and over and over again, makes me think that they were trying to insinuate that she was married to Captain Jack Sparrow without actually using Jack Sparrow. But they talk about him being a particularly terrible human being. And I don't know, something about it just gave me the ick. Besides that, we never get to see him. We never get to see any of her swashbuckling piracy. The only thing that sort of alludes to this life is that she's wearing pants, pretty much wearing pants all the time. And she's wearing, pirate boots that have, Western style spurs, which I do know are a thing that have been around for centuries prior to, Westerns making them popular. Now, that being said, her appearance aside doesn't really matter in the long context of things. I mean, you kind of go into the show sort of having an understanding that girl boss is girl bossing. So, of course, pants in, 18th century England. She does wear dresses occasionally, but the dresses that they give her have easy open buttons that she can just take off all of the skirts and just be in pants again, which not a thing, but it is in the show. It's fine. So essentially what happens is her Captain Jackson is killed. She comes back to the place that she is born and ends up getting framed for a murder. Now, most of all of the sort of bad things that happen subsequently are really a response to just her being this headstrong woman who won't take anything from any man, right? She hears that there is a man of high stature who basically just is inappropriate towards her sister, though in the show we never see a single bit of that. Yes, he is a jerk, and yes, he is distasteful as far as men go, but we never see much of his behavior. None of the things that he does are done on camera, if that makes sense. Other than just sort of being an ass, none of his crimes or activities that he does that are bad are really ever on camera for the most part. And she essentially stands up to him, gets someone killed because said boy is not a fan of her stepping up to him, essentially. And then she just sort of takes off. Like, she just sort of books it and leaves these people to fend for themselves after pissing off the guy that's already sort of made their lives a living hell. I don't know, for reasons, I guess. And then, of course, she comes back to like rescue said family, and things just kind of get continually worse. The issue that I have with Renegade Nell is not really against Renegade Nell. The issue that I have with it, or the thing that I find the most frustrating, is that the show has so much potential. This reminds me of one of those sort of scenarios, the missed it by that much kind of scenario. And it was so close, so stinking close that it's irritating, because the show could potentially have been really great. And to see something like that is so close to that mark coming out of Disney is very promising. I think that Renegade Nell, for me, is one of those shows that, and this is going to sound ridiculous because, as I mentioned, I only made it to episode 3. I do not intend to continue watching the rest of the show, but it is a show that, if they were to change some things and kind of get their act together, pull their heads out sort of situation, and come back for a season 2, having corrected the things that I feel like they didn't do well in the first season, I would struggle bus it through season 1 in order to watch like season 2 and continuing seasons. I feel like the biggest issue that they have going on here, aside from Nell Jackson, main character, being the largest Mary Sue for no reason whatsoever, aside from that, putting that aside, they don't have any laws or rules happening in their fantastical make-believe world, which I understand sounds a little dumb. Like, why would you have rules in a fantasy land? They're necessary. I promise you they're necessary. When you're writing a story, let's take any fictional book, anything that Stephen King writes, any sort of fantasy book that's being written. When you're talking about magic systems, or you're talking about the world in which these realistic, quote unquote, characters are meant to exist, you want there to be laws to that magic system. You want people to understand the way that they work. And the more sort of rules that you put in place for your fiction, the more believability you give to that thing, if that makes any sense. So in Renegade Nell, there is absolutely no reason for anything that is happening at all. We are introduced to her character having these magical abilities. And I will say her magical abilities aren't magic. It literally is a little fairy man, specifically a fairy man, who is actually in another show that I'm not going to be able to think of off the top of my head, but it's one that I really enjoy. It's the soccer one. You guys are going to know what I'm talking about, the like feely good soccer movie. Anyway, it's that guy, and he is a fairy, and essentially what he can do is shrink himself down into like a tiny little blip of light, maybe the size of a marble, let's say, and he will go into her mouth or into her ear, I think one time, but the majority of the time he's going into her mouth. And then subsequently she gets like superhuman strength. She can beat up anyone. She can catch bullets. She can Matrix style dodge bullets. Like, all of this incredible stuff is happening. But she apparently isn't aware of it. And when she asks said ferryman like why he's there, he's like, to protect you for reasons unbeknownst to anyone. And that makes it annoying. And the story itself, on top of just her magical ability and when it's allowed and when it isn't, on top of that, the remainder of the story, it just doesn't necessarily go in a direction, right? It seems like there's a whole bunch of piece parts and a whole bunch of other characters that need to be involved that really at the end of the day make the story very bloated, and it doesn't make very much sense. Like, between the action sequences, which I think are or can be fun. There are a lot of them, and it does get a little mundane after a while, but I think the action sequences are great. I only don't like the fact that every single action sequence they play the exact same like musical sequence. And so when you're seeing 3 or 4 action sequences in one episode, that music to me gets irritating because I don't like the repetitive nature of that type of thing. But that I feel like is a personal, problem. But other than that, like when there is no action going, the story just sort of doesn't go anywhere, if that makes sense. Like they run into different characters that join their team. There are characters that just, I feel like are there mostly for like a love interest to someone else, but they don't really move the story along or play any particular part beyond that. But I feel like if the showrunner or if the writers, whoever happens to be in charge here, could trim the fat, and yes, that would mean trimming out some of the excess characters, of which I feel like there are a lot in this show. If you could trim the fat of that, trim the fat of the story, really get an idea of where you want to go with this character, set up some ground rules to your magic system, to the world that they live in. If this is meant to be a realistic style 18th century England, with magic, then let things play out realistically. I mean, there are situations where the main character, for instance, absolutely should be dead and lives for just the reason of we need her to continue living. It reminds me sort of the Ahsoka episode where she's in the water for an ungodly amount of time and she should be deceased. But because she is the main character, she just continues to live for reasons. It reminds me of that. And I feel like if they could come back and really just do a 180 to this story, I think that this show has really amazing potential because it is in some ways a lot of fun. It's just the middle parts, the parts in between those good things that stretch it out and make it not so great. So though I won't be continuing to watch Renegade Nell, I will keep my eye out for a second season and give that a go to see have they improved, have they not, and see kind of how that looks. But Renegade Nell is just one of those that's frustrating because it comes so close to being a really good time and a really fun thing to watch. And it just misses that mark in desperately needing to make a Mary Sue and not really thinking about the story outside of strong female character. And that is really disappointing because I feel like the acting here is great. The costuming is good, outside of the cowboy spurs, which could be there, could be realistic. I just feel weird about it, But outside of that, I feel like the costuming is good. There are a lot of fun sort of sequences just in the first 3 episodes, but I feel like it's everything in between that kind of just doesn't work as well as I would hope to keep my attention for a show of this nature. So those are my thoughts on Renegade Nell. This is a bit of a longer one, but I would love to know what you guys thought of this series if you have watched it. Subscribe to join the Movie Nerd family, and I hope to see you in the next episode.